Just one comeback to start with. I don't understand why UKIP becoming a laughing stock and the decline of the BNP is a contradiction. I think the reason Nigel Farage is laughing is because the decline of UKIP as a political party is irrelevant now because they've planted their sleeper bomb in the heart of the Conservative Party.
Yes.
The results
Yes.
of the local elections show that the Conservative Party has successfully moved its centre ground to the right, and therefore, because of its anti-immigration policies and hostile environment via the Daily Mail, mopped up all of those UKIP voters.
Yes.
Absolutely every single one of them is now voting Conservative, and so the decline of UKIP is now irrelevant. That mission has succeeded. Just like UKIP mopped up all the BNP voters. There's no contradiction there. This is about the reconfiguration of the far right and how it works. They're celebrating like they won the World Cup because they've disrupted the status quo and moved the centre ground to the right. It's historic what they've done. They're celebrating for good reason from their ideological perspective. And what's happening behind the scenes now is that the far right is reconfiguring again. Watch this space. What's happening now is this vampiric, wealth-backed racism turning into a new configuration of the far right, funded by Aaron Banks, who backed the whole Leave campaign, who funded the whole thing, and they're working out what to do next. So it's not a contradiction, it's an absolute, clearly tracked historical process unfolding.
I think, I mean, absolutely, and that's what, as you say, and it's not only the Tory party, it would be, in fact, if you look at how Labour campaigns in relation to immigration, you know, everyone's shifted, and there's this idea that that's what people want, that's how you get the votes, and it's that kind of circle that's being reproduced. I guess what I'm saying is, but it is still significant that UKIP, the BNP, these people that are campaigning under one nation politics, which, you know, the Tory party is still campaigning about everything and immigration is part of a general package, that those parties which are clearly one nation, that are clearly have got you know, it doesn't take much digging to work out they've got a xenophobic and racist agenda, they're not, you know, this creeping fascism, I guess I'm saying it's complicated because it was creeping, then it's definitely had a victory in that it's got all the parties scared that this is what the populists want, you know, that we all want immigration and then control and so on, but at the same time there's something going on in how that's represented and how that. So I think that complicates, you know, can we call it creeping, is creeping something? Can we call it fascism? Can we call it, you know, I guess that's what I'm getting at. Yeah,
I think it's in that area of the relationship between the crisis of social democracy and increasing authoritarianism that the people want. That's why it's authoritarian populism, because the people are manipulating into wanting more authority.
Right. I don't think
No, but that's what the manufacture of consent is about, isn't it?
It's not manufacturing consent.
Okay, can we let's get the other people to comment on Catherine's. If any of the other people would like to comment on Catherine's comments on your paper. First, before we move,
Oh, you got
Ryan, Anna, Insa, on Catherine, what she said about the papers.
Just on Catherine, not on this.
Well, right now, I'd just like to say thank you. That was brilliant. I really appreciate your comments there.
It's great. I loved reading them. I really did. You know.
Really, really nice to get.
Okay, so I'm gonna open to people because otherwise it's just gonna become a thing here, and you already talk.
Yeah.
Anyone? Okay,
Deborah.
Matt. Well, Deborah, Matt.
Right next to
Yeah, and okay. So I'll take 3. Well, let's take 2 and then let's take 3. Yeah. Matt, you want to go first?
That was a really, really great panel, all really fascinating papers and a really riveting discussion from Catherine. I guess this is an open question and sort of provocation. Partly follows on from discussion me and Catherine were having outside the club yesterday about ethnographic and anthropological work with the far right and around the far right and around fascism and authoritarian populism. But it's sort of, I think this panel demonstrates the huge importance of doing ethnographic and anthropological work around these issues, and our ability as social scientists to kind of make sense of the present state of things, and to try and find the language. I think, Gillian, you put it this, the left hasn't had an adequate symbolic language to kind of articulate what's happened in the last 30, 40 years. And in a way, this panel, I think, is developing that language, albeit a kind of language of critique and deconstruction. So it's really an open question about what do we as anthropologists and social scientists need to be doing in terms of stepping into the public debate in a perhaps a more normative fashion, and to take this ability we have to deconstruct and understand beyond the bounds of academic discussion in a way that's sort of strategically effective, I suppose. So it's just an open question for anyone to take up.
Deborah.
Well, thank you very much for the papers. I like the way that they kind of fitted together and yet didn't quite fit together. I think the one thing I'm learning is that there is no single explanation for what you might call authoritarian populism. In fact, that may not be the title of the panel. There's a huge debate about populism and what it actually means, and it used to be used in one way in Latin America, and it's now been used in different kinds of ways right across the piece, and often it has actually been used to refer to more left-oriented politics, and so right now it seems like it's going in a particular direction. But what I found useful was this whole insight that we got from the Giacomo's paper into regionalism and localism, because I think there's a little bit of a tendency, especially in Britain right now, to sort of generalize across the piece. So we're talking, I know that all of you have done so all of you have done specific fieldwork in particular areas, and that helps us to sort of move beyond this idea that the whole population, or at least the Brexit supporting population, are all in a single camp with a certain uniformity. I feel like if we take the Italian paper, it suggests that there's a huge complexity even within a specific area about what the local actually represents and how you might want to defend that or not defend it. So I think it's quite useful to see these papers in sort of connection with each other, rather than maybe getting too involved in a specific debate about Britain and Italy, but rather sort of see them in connection. And just the other thing I liked was the way that, so in Inza and Ryan's paper, in a sense you're sort of speaking against what has often been the common logic on, well, the widespread logic on vigilantism. So, i.e. when people feel the state's not going to do its job, they just say, right, we're going to do the vigilante thing. But in fact what you're showing is that there's a huge nuance, because one minute people are tending to invite the state in, but another minute they're kind of repudiating it. And of course the difference between the sort of local state and the regional state and the kind of national state, there again, is quite an important one to bear in mind.
Okay, Martin, you wanna go ahead?
Thanks. Yeah. Well, yeah, I also have to say that I really like the different papers, and my question is for Ryan and Insa. Or it's more of a comment actually. I very much like what you're doing, that you're trying to understand as you say, the political and the moral life worlds of the residents of Park End and Waltham. And then you say, well, and these life worlds are different from the state-centric perspectives, right? That we often hear about, that we often read about. And then actually, I thought that the examples that you give in the paper are still pretty much state-related. I mean, perhaps not necessarily state-centric, but it's people react to the presence of the state, or they mimic the presence of the state, or they adapt in very creative ways their livelihoods and their practices to the presence of the state. So I thought, well, and I mean, running the risk of ending up in a semantic discussion, but is it really not state-centric? Because I can see that it's different, and I can, but it's the presence of the state is pretty much there. And perhaps, and I guess you also have data on that, it perhaps would be possible to show more of people's aspirations or own ideas that are not necessarily linked up with the presence of the state, in order to even better understand their moral and political life worlds, because that's what you actually want to show. Yeah.
Okay, just one last question from you.
I'll save mine because mine's about the refiguring of the middle classes in relation to Brexit. And it's quite different. So I'll
Okay,
save that
so
for
let's do this and then okay.
Can I?
Yes, go Ryan.
So, sort of responding to Matt, your point.
Do you mind if I sit here? Because I feel like I'm in the way of like.
You can sit on the behind the
we
desk.
could all move round and you do that.
No, it's fine. It's
come
fine.
here and we move round.
Behind the desk.
Thrown.
It's okay.
Yeah, Matt, probably responding to your point and also a point that you made, Catherine, thank you for it, about what emotions are generated by the sense that you're exposed to state coercion on a regular basis, and your hint, as I took it, that maybe those affects are quite kind of inert in a way, but the directions in which they get channeled can vary, and that's my impression of what happens. So I feel like a point that we can make kind of into public discourse is the contingency of what happens to the sorts of resentments that are created by economic devastation. So a lot, like whether they become progressive or regressive, basically, or xenophobic, it depends on a lot of other things and can vary even in the space of one conversation. So, for example, a couple of middle-aged white men that I spoke to during my field work would, in the same breath, speak nostalgically about the railway union that they were members of, and then also Enoch Powell was right. And it could just fluctuate in a conversation, kind of really in such a wobbly way, like what it was. I'd also like to just respond quickly to Martin, and maybe it bears elaboration on what we're meaning with this term state-centric, and really, like I would imagine in a state-centric perspective, the state's very often absent because it's taken for granted, and its positionality is the analytic position too. So that's kind of the reason why the state looms so large in a position that we would say isn't state-centric, because there's an attempt to sort of have analytical distance from it. But I also really take the point about non-state related values and experiences.
I had to think because in Nietzsche's earlier work, you actually describe situations in which the state seems to be completely irrelevant in the lives of people. That's why I think that as well.
Yeah, I guess in this paper we were starting from the point of view of trying to deconstruct the authoritarian dimensions of state policy, so that's why we're talking much more. In this particular paper, we're interested to unpack the authoritarian dimensions of state policies themselves, which is why that we're focusing perhaps disproportionately on the state, and the sort of aspect about alternative moral values doesn't really come to the fore. But what I would say is, I guess, just to elaborate on this sort of state-centric perspective, I think there is a pervasive assumption in so much political and social kind of classical theory that the state is the generative source of order, and that in the absence of strong institutional mechanisms that can maintain order, we will degenerate into chaos, that sort of Hobbesian legacy. And I think it's just, and it is dangerous. I think this is what a lot of the anthropological literature in Britain did in the 1980s. It sort of went too far into the sort of community side of things, and this is a little bit what we're trying to do in the paper, to say, well, look, let's not shift back to kind of positioning society against the state, because this is very much what the community-centered studies did. And so, I think you're raising really important points, but I think the answer to it is not to push one out of the picture at the expense of the other, but to really try and understand how, localized moralities and social relationships, we focus on social reproduction here, map or don't map onto particular state processes, and how different actors sort of zoom in and out of the picture. So that's not a clear-cut response to what you're saying, but I think this is what I would say. But can I just respond briefly to Matt, your comment about, so if I can just paraphrase what you're saying, you correct me if I, forgot what you said, or misunderstood. So what you are saying is, at a time where, you know, the far right and kind of right-wing populism is becoming a real threat, what should the actual kind of normative and practical agenda of anthropology be? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess just specifically, like, you've all done a really good job of doing justice to complexity.
Yeah.
And showing how these social realities unfold in highly complex and contradictory ways in people's everyday lives. And that allows us an understanding of what's happening in different settings that journalists don't get close to.
Yeah.
But of course, people make sense of their worlds in an incredibly mediatised way, which is one of the ways
Catherine
in which...
was saying, yeah.
Yeah, which is one of the ways in which this creeping fascism is creeping its way in. So I guess the sense is, what can this really important... How do we get this knowledge out in effective ways? And I think this is probably an unfair question, because I don't think any of us have an easy answer to it. But I guess it's just one I wanted to throw out.
You want to say something, Insa, and then Giacomo?
Do I want to say about that? How do we get that knowledge out? I think, I mean, there's different ways of doing it. I think in terms of our own intellectual agendas as anthropologists and what we should be talking about, you know, I guess what we tried to do in this paper was to precisely shift the focus of the debate away from this idea that all we need to look at is the, you know, is the pathos of the people, what's going on, you know, in people's minds and why they're all turning right wing, and instead trying to understand what we actually mean when we talk about authoritarianism, and to really understand historically and ethnographically what that kind of localized experience of authoritarianism is and who the different state actors are. I think the other thing that I would say is, you know, I've been going back to the field now for the last 4 or 5 weeks, and this is 2-3 years on from Brexit, and what I find as you talk to people, and Brexit has just become this huge thing that no one wants to talk about anymore. You know, people are so sick of it. And actually, for a lot of people at the time when it happened, Brexit, at least on my feed side, just wasn't such a big deal. You know, some people literally didn't know on the day if they wanted to go and vote in favour of Leave or in favour of Remain, or if they were going to vote at all. But once the vote has happened, it becomes this thing where you're either on the Remain or the Leave side. And I think what anthropologists can also do is to capture that kind of fluidity, that kind of complexity, that sort of, well, do you know what, I actually didn't know what I was going to do, I wasn't going to vote at all, you know, and to be careful not to read singular narratives into that. So,
Giacomo, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's something to say about it, and I think like what Matt's and Deb's comment really meshed together nicely, because I must say I do share Deb's uneasiness about the width of the category of populism, and we with Susanna's project we had a workshop on populism in January last year. And Susanna came up in the final debate with a very interesting reflection of how somehow populism as a category has become something equivalent to Trouillot's savage slut, where you put everything that is you don't identify with or you identify against in many ways, but it becomes like really a melting pot where you put all the things that you don't like. And I think, I mean, this relates, I mean, the one answer we can have to this and to avoid this is, I think, really ethnography. What you said, like, it is important to put your body into that melting pot and accept the interactions with people that you really often don't like. I mean, my previous fieldwork was with former neo-fascist terrorists and like assassins in many cases, and so for me it was even more. But then in the long run of ethnographic interaction, I think you're forced to, you know, like share spaces and interactions and also actually really try to understand. And throughout these last 15 years, I've been trying to say in a somehow provocative way, but I also believe it, that like we all know what these people are wrong about, but we need to understand what they are right about, not in the sense that we need to subscribe to their policies to solving the problems, but recognize the problems that make them so successful these days, and in relation to what you were saying, try to formulate possible answers that are not, that are not violent or you know, like, but I think it really, answering your question, it's really about doing ethnography and then scaling up to what Insa was saying yesterday of like looking at larger processes of structural transformation that we can see in the hyper-localized ethnographic relationship, and then try to problematize those and offer also to politics, and especially left-wing politics, like a political jargon of analysis of these processes in order to address them also at the governative, administrative, like policy-making level, I think.
Okay, Jaime wanted to. Oh, yes.
So just also in relation to Matt and Deborah's and the end of what you were saying, and again, thank you for your comments, they're really useful. But I think it is really interesting, like how we can sort of show the complexity about what's going on. So, for example, in my classes, which I was doing during the run-up to the Brexit referendum, people would go between discourses of how they felt they were really fairly untreated by the kind of British immigration system. Yet many of them, many of them who could in fact vote, were going to vote Brexit because of the worries that they had about immigration and so on. And again, I think what you're sort of saying about the media, and then what you were saying, Matt, about then how the media presents a kind of simplistic view of these things. So how to kind of, put back, go work against that kind of simplistic idea. But yet how then again that's kind of sort of established. So for example, in these classes there would be the Sun, illegal immigrant, blah blah blah, that people were reading. So they're reading all this kind of negative stuff. They were living a whole other reality, and then they were somehow retelling a kind of mixture of these things, which is just incredibly complicated. And I have no idea how you then what you do about it. But it's just all these kind of ironies that in one way they're actually very kind of funny, but also deeply not funny at all.
Jaime, do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes.
And then Tobias. Okay.
Okay. So the first question will be for Ryan and Insa, and then I'll try to, because it's something very specific about your paper, and then I'll try to take it from there and broaden the question for everybody else. So in your paper, you highlighted the coercive power of the state to enforce debts and tenancies. And I was wondering, what are the existing legal guarantees for tenants and people who are repaying their mortgages and might have defaulted, and how can they be expanded? So for example, in Spain, different city councils have managed to circumvent state limitations, and for example, they've made it compulsory for social services to be there. And there are ways to short circuit the whole process, and city councils are doing that. Leftists, the new ones, in Madrid, Barcelona, in Madrid less than Barcelona. And other things like what happens if there are minors. I'm just asking this because although I agree on the fact that the state is increasingly authoritarian, there are still legal guarantees for people, and people know those. Luckily, there are still levers that you can pull to resist in a very, very hard environment and unfair. And also, and maybe this would be even more specific, what's the law in England regulating evictions? It is the name of the law, and but maybe this is for a talk afterwards. Maybe the audience will be bored about that. And the question for everybody else is that, well, in Insa and Ryan's paper and in others, you are valorizing different responses to state coercion. But then along the lines of what Matt was saying, along the lines of looking for normative, or I would say political responses that we can also imagine or build, how do you think that people can organize currently? Based on your ethnographic work, how do you think that people can organize to protect their social rights? So for example, question, and again following Matt's invitation, would you do that by suggesting ways, or looking at the ways in which, the potential ways in which people can maybe build, or try and transform how the state operates, or is that going to come through communitarian alternatives? Is it going to come, this is the classic debate between, changing the state or building something outside of it that maybe connects with some of the discussions we had yesterday. Or can anthropologists think of concrete legal measures or, strategic litigation forms to advance the rights of people in a context of of an increasingly authoritarian state. And then, or should, anthropologists, could anthropologists studying these problems put forth transformative ideas that have to do not so much with how to transform the state, how to implement measures, but maybe how to challenge the moral framework legitimizing this kind of popular authoritarianism? Is that what we have to do? Produce narratives, which is a different thing. You produce discourse. Academia can also do that, even though there are some academics, especially the most positivist social scientists, might say that would be moralizing. But I don't agree with that. I think that we have to abide by what we preach, as you said before, and I think that building narratives from research, if those narratives are based on evidence, if those narratives are, even though any narrative will tend to be reductionist at the end of the day, if they are based on scientific or empirical evidence, there's a lot that can be done there, right? And that's another way that we maybe can challenge the growing popular authoritarianism everywhere.
Okay.
Excuse me for the long...
No, it's fine. We'll take Toby and then I'll give you space.
I just remember Bev had a question.
Oh, yeah, but
it
later.
disrupted the flow, so we'll do it later.
Toby, then the answer, and then you want to.
Yeah, this is a puzzle for all, maybe. I've tremendously enjoyed the panel, and in a way, the panel seems to be, or partly seems to be about kind of the absurdity of citizenship, or the instability and absurdity of citizenship, because it's clear from, at least since Bush, it's clear citizenship doesn't mean much in terms of rights entitlements, and because you can still lose your rights, and the experiences of exclusion, systematic exclusion that Insa and Ryan talk about, show quite clearly that kind of there is maybe kind of not that much value in this type of membership, and yet Anna, you showed this paradox, I think, perfectly. There is a kind of Britishness that we have to pretend to know about, but that we're never going to be part of, but it's kind of useful because it's easier to travel. So there's this kind of, it's there, it's a category that can kind of be invoked and mobilized, but at the same time it's also very banal. It's also very meaningless in many situations. And maybe, Insa, what you said at the end, maybe we should think about these categories as something that actually are relatively easy to mobilize sometimes, because they don't mean so much. So this, I don't know, Brexit, am I going to vote or not? Maybe that's the way of thinking about support for these kind of populist movements, not in terms of high-level indoctrination, but the sense of, I don't know. And in a way, there's an absurdity also in what you said, Jack, with this kind of extremely regional story that is now the popular all over Italy, which kind of contradicts the story because it's a very regional story about everybody knows each other and trusts, and there's these networks with it. Also, so this kind of so maybe there's a relatively low threshold feeling to these kind of categories, but that also means they can be removed easier.
Okay, one last question by Toby, and then you answer.
Links with Toby. Two questions. One was to Anna, one was to Insa and Ryan. So it's kind of the absurdity of citizenship question. So your paper very nicely described the way, the whole point of this test is to kind of promote a particular type of supposedly British cultural capital, and a way in which that excludes whole categories of people. But do you have any kind of sense of or evidence about the experience of taking this test, in the sense of what type of citizen it actually produces? In thinking about your earlier work, and how engaging with the Italian immigration process produces a particular type of cultural practice. So what's the experience of doing this test? Does it produce a sense of the absurdity of being a British citizen, or is it cynicism, or is there ever any kind of commitment to British values, whatever they might be? And so what does it mean, and in the end, if you pass, you ended with this photograph of this woman becoming a British citizen, what type of citizen does she end up being? The other question was to Ryan about kind of, it's a bit crude, but what type of story are you telling about liberalism here? So are you telling a story that effectively says we have never been liberal? Authoritarianism has been underpinning the British state all along? Or are you telling a story about the way in which liberalism depends in and of itself on forms of coercion in some places to enable freedom in other places for other people in other ways? So is there an articulation of freedom and coercion here, or is there coercion kind of all the way down?
Okay, we have two more. Do you want to answer this and then take Francis and Bev, or do you want to? What do you?
Me?
No, you guys. What do you feel?
What time do we finish?
We have 10 more minutes.
I think it's more useful to get questions.
Okay, so Francis and then Bev, you go.
I'm okay.
You okay? Okay, so just you.
This is just a donkey.
Okay.
It's sort of, I think it's more of a reflection than a question, but in a lot of the discussion about populism and about regionalism and new nationalism, new right-wing nationalisms, right-wing movements, I've been thinking a lot about Eastern Europe and what the parallels are and what the differences are, and historically, and my own work's in Poland, but I think this also refers a lot to Hungary and Slovakia, and probably to other places too. That you have in the first period when the communist state collapses and there's no real state anywhere for a while, what you have is the intervention of the IMF and the banks, the World Bank, and the different know-how things, and people saying this is how you have to redo your economy, and we're going to reverse everything. So if you had collectives, you're going to have small farms, and if you had small farms, you're going to have big farms, and all the factories would go. So you have that massive deindustrialization and restructuring, and at that point through the 90s. I think you see this really, really strong thing towards the kinds of regionalism that you're talking about. That the only people you trust are our people, national people, and the factories that have closed down all become little tiny cottage industries in people's basements. But they're saying at the same time, we're going backwards. We shouldn't be doing this. We were a great modern nation, a great industrial nation, and it's all gone. But it gets translated into this regionalism that only here our stuff's good. This is we don't want any of this stuff from outside. We just want this from we make it here, and this is stuff we used to make in the factories or we used to make in the farms. And then it seems to me that things stabilize a bit, and then you go into EU accession, and that's where then there seems to be more and more affluence in a lot of these countries, but a lot of that's linked to EU funding and EU project, EU rescuing of the really, really poor areas, very much like a lot of the discussions here around Wales and Cornwall and stuff. And it's in those areas particularly that you're getting now, and really since about 2005, much more clearly articulated nationalist new right movements. Obviously in Hungary, very strongly in the whole anti-Roma movement, but in Poland, a completely bizarre new right movement that goes right across and it's against anything that isn't white Polish male Catholic and holy mothers, so it seems to me that these are different phases, that they're linked somehow, but it's really useful, I think, and I think this is a bit what various people have been saying at different times, to look at these. I think it comes out very much in Jacko's paper that you have different sides of the same thing coming up in reaction to particular critical moments, and then how people realign those ideas, and how they sometimes they become really big, and sometimes they're much more, let's stay here where this area of trust is and family, and we can use all that language. And I think it seemed to me that there are a lot of reverberations of that in some of this material that's worth looking at Eastern Europe.
Okay, one last question, Antonio?
Yeah, it's just a comment more than a question. I don't know if, but it's, I actually agree with Deborah that the Italian case, along with the British one, really suggests many interesting things. It gives things to think about. And I think that reading Giacomo's analysis, discussions of the crisis of local populism, under the light of what's happening in Italy, what has been happening over the last months or last year, which is the shift in the political strategy of Lega Nord, basically, that started change from a regionalist party claiming rhetorically separation from the rest of Italy to a nationalist party, much following the example of the National Front, Le Pen in France, through several interesting strategies in communication, etc. The interesting thing is that this strategy was successful. And it was pushed under several keywords, and one was national sovereignty. I think in a way the Brexit is something that crisscrossed the Brexit issue, that how it was played out, this rhetoric of national sovereignty. And what was being said about citizenship, which is very loose, and this, perhaps these two cases of this absurd rise of Lega Nord as a nationalist party, the consent of Lega Nord and Brexit, or might be an expression of a demand of national sovereignty, that is actually linked to the fact that citizenship is still fought through the idea of national sovereignty, of being part of a national body. So this is actually, and in my opinion, something interesting, the fact that there is a lack of elaboration of new ideas, of a new basis of citizenship. So this is perhaps to be one way of putting in relation the two cases.
Okay, so we have, well, officially 5 minutes. Can we go over 5 minutes? Okay.
I think just one person, Robin, might have to go, but please
feel
free, and we'll say goodbye in advance.
Gillian, I think you said you wanted to say something, right?
Yeah, I think it is really important to have this historical overview. I know there's a strong push for the ethnography, and we need the ethnography. But I think there's also a moment where it's really important, if you have a long history of fieldwork experience, there's an important moment where you have to step back and take a theoretical overview. And I think this moment requires that. We do need the ethnography, but we actually need the analytical oversight, like a bird's eye view, to kind of come up and have a look and say, what is this historical conjuncture? What is actually happening here? Okay, well, what is happening in the UK? What is happening in France? What is happening in Italy? What is happening in Hungary? What is happening in the USA? And then to have these conversations across cases that tell us about the contradictions and complexities of the historical conjuncture we're living through. But I think it's not okay to keep making the claim that we have to retreat to our ethnography. We need the ethnography. It's really important to have it for all of its all that it can yield, but there is also this moment for pulling back. But then I think there's also something else, which is that anthropologists tend far too much just to talk to each other and pat each other on the back a lot about how clever they are. And unfortunately, even though we're all horribly busy, there is this other work to do in this moment, which is that we have to translate what on earth we're talking about to the public and to the media. And it means being exhausted in that effort, because we have to care about whether or not the public understand what anthropology is about. We have to care about making the extra effort to speak to journalists and to get on Newsnight and to confront Nick Griffin and these people in a way that the journalists are incapable of doing. But we have to get that invite, and the only way you're going to get that is if you do the extra work to make your work comprehensible to anyone other than other anthropologists who pat themselves on the back and pay their mortgages, including me.
Yeah.
You know, and that I really feel strongly that's kind of that's the moment that we're in. And I think one of the reasons that I've made this experimental campaign is because I'm trying, as an anthropologist, to say, what happens if we make a symbolic gesture in this political moment? And that actually that's what people are crying out for. People are crying out for symbolic gestures that make it possible to reorganize the collective basis for their social understanding, because that's currently under threat.
I'm thinking impact case study.
But will you buy a T-shirt?
I'll buy 2.
Anyone else from the panel would like to answer to any of the questions that were, or comments that were? Ryan, Giacomo, Anna?
Should I answer, Toby?
Yeah.
So thanks for your question, Toby. And yeah, interestingly, it's kind of a classic anthropological finding that it's unintended consequences. So I also did fieldwork at the actual test centres, which are nothing to the school, is the official place that you go to take the test. And people I'd met there who normally had passed the test, who hadn't had the classes, so they were able just to read the handbook by themselves over a couple of days and then do it. They were like, oh, it's just a kind of waste of time. I don't really need to do this. It's totally pointless. And then, of course, the people who attended these schools, actually, they did really, although they kind of resented it, they did come to really enjoy the experience. But it had nothing to do with the test or the handbook, and it had all to do with the fact they had this charismatic teacher, and that actually learning was this quite fun thing, and he went way more in depth into British history than was kind of necessary, and they actually just really enjoyed learning about British history, although there was plenty of arguments and so on. But it had nothing to do with the test and all just to do with the kind of learning. And that, in a way, was kind of even then more sort of poignantly sad because they were sort of being excluded from this thing. Anyway, people would get up like on the chairs and sing the national anthem as the teacher. So yeah.
Anyone? Ryan, Giacomo, Insa?
I mean, I wrote all the questions down, and I mean, this is a bit of a lame response, but I do want to think about them more. I kind of feel like I want to answer them over a pint rather than now.
Oh, yeah.
If that is okay.
So, just to say thanks to everyone for this session, it's really great. I think what we need to do, so we are going to have a plenary, but maybe we need like 5 to 10 minutes to just